Study 5, A Nation is Born, and the Failed Theocracy.
As we come to our fifth study in our Understanding the Old Testament, we find ourselves stuck in the first period of the four periods of the Old Testament, namely the period when God is forming the nation. This happens to be the longest of the periods. And we said that Genesis 12:2, where the Abrahamic covenant is given for the very first time, is sort of the launching pad for the next 700 years of Old Testament history, as God begins to form the nation, first of all, by bringing people into the nation. And it's taken a long time, but Israel is now, when the book of Exodus opens up, at about 2.5 to 3 million people. When Moses then leads the people out of slavery, out of Egypt, where they have been located for hundreds of years, they go down to Mount Sinai. And in our last study, that's where we left them, down at Mount Sinai. And we answered the question as to why would they go that route when there's a lot shorter and more direct route up to the land of Canaan. And the reason was, number one, God told Moses that to come back down to this spot, and in the place away from a lot of nations and people, they would learn about the Lord their God. They would worship Him. And He also didn't take them that way because to get to Canaan, you had to go through Philistine territory, and those were the bad boys in the neighborhood at the time. They liked to fight, and Israel was not really ready to fight. But there was other reasons as well, and that was that God needed time to do certain things. And so they go down to Mount Sinai, and there three things, we said, would take place. Number one, the giving of the law. Number two, the construction of the portable worship center, which was known as the tabernacle. And third, there was a number of organizational things that needed to take place, establishing the priesthood, getting the army in place, how they were going to march from that point into the promised land. So the first thing that of importance, of course, in our study is that Israel is now given their law code. And there are several things, in fact, 7 of them, that I've sort of gleaned out to package about this law code. And the first one is that the law code, which comprises well over 600 different laws, was given to the nation of Israel. In fact, in Exodus chapter 20, we read this very clear statement. Then God spoke to all these things to Israel, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And the covenant, this is a covenant, a conditional one now, that is being made where God says, you obey me, I will bless you. You disobey me, you're going to have problems. But they had agreed that they would, in fact, keep this covenant. In chapter 19, the chapter right before the giving of the 10 Commandments and so much of the law, Moses went up and down Mount Sinai and was established as the mediator of the covenant. So, when they get down to Mount Sinai, Moses goes up. And the Lord says to Moses up there, Moses, ask the people if they will enter into a conditional covenant with me. Okay, down the mountain he goes. The Lord wants to know, you all want to enter, willing to enter into a covenant with Him, to obey Him? Mm-hmm. Yep, we are. They said yes. Okay. Then go down, and he goes up and down a number of times, establishing the fact that God and Israel are now going to enter into another covenant. This one happens to be conditional. And so a law code is going to be given. So what's interesting about this is to remember that the law code is not being made with mankind, interestingly enough. We sometimes don't think that. We think that this law code was for everybody. It wasn't. It was really given to the nation of Israel. The people that I delivered out of Egypt are the ones that I am making this covenant with. That does affect very dramatically how we apply or don't apply the law code to our own lives and to ourselves. Another thing about the law code is that it is a unit. The law code is made up of some 600 plus laws, and it's not a cafeteria where you take your tray through and decide, oh, I like that law. I think I'll keep that one. Those laws I'm not keen on. Oh, I'll take that law too. The point of both Old and New Testament is you want to keep the law code, then you have to keep all 613. I'm sort of amused sometimes, maybe that's not the right word, with people who say, well, you know, I keep the law of God. Well, no, you don't. To keep the law of God means you keep all 613 of them perfectly. And the reality is there's not a human being on the face of the earth who's ever done that. But the law code is a unit, and you can't pick and choose what you would like to keep. It's all or nothing kind of a thing. The third thing about the law code is that it was designed from its original giving to be temporary. Now, this isn't given in Exodus, but it is given in the New Testament, where the point that's being made is that this law code of Moses is in effect until the Anointed One comes. And the Anointed One is, of course, identified as Jesus the Christ. And so, you know, in your pantry, you've got cans in your pantry, and if you look at the bottom of it, it says, best if used before, you know, September of whatever year. Well, the law code's a bit like that. If you look at the bottom of the law code, it says, best if used before April 33 AD, because that's when Jesus came, died on the cross, and the law code was set aside at that point in time. Now, it doesn't mean we are lawless people, because 9 out of the 10 commandments are repeated as the standards of living for us. So it's just as wrong to go to the local Walmart and steal today as it was to steal from Honest Abe's store back in the Old Testament. The only one that's not repeated of the 10 commandments is the Sabbath, which is a Saturday time of cessation and worship. That's not given in this age. But the standards, in essence, are much higher in the New Testament for believers today than it is for people in the Old Testament. But the law was designed to be temporary. Furthermore, the law was never given as a matter of saving the nation of Israel. People give you the impression sometime as they talk about it that if I keep the law, I'm going to get right with God. Well, a couple of problems with that. Number one, you can't. And number two, the law was never designed to do that. That's not the purpose of the law code. And once again, this is explained to us in the New Testament scriptures. Paul, in discussing the Abrahamic covenant, which we've looked at, and the Mosaic law code, makes the point that the law was given really to protect Israel. And the term that he uses comes out of Roman culture. It talks about a tutor. The law was a tutor. Now, when you think of being a tutor today, you think of little Johnny who just doesn't get math at all, doing terrible in math. So you get a tutor in to teach little Johnny about the matter of adding, subtracting, whatever else Johnny needs. The law, when the Romans talked about a tutor, that's not exactly what they had in mind. A wealthy parent would actually hire, or they would buy a slave, and a lot of slaves had PhDs, by the way. They were taken from other countries, the elite, and they would buy this slave, and part of the slave was to teach little Demetrius math and whatever else he needed to know. So they taught, but also the slave had the tutor had a second function, and that was when little Demetrius went out on the town, if he's under 17 years old, the tutor went with him. He's a bodyguard. He protects them. And Paul living in Roman, being a Roman citizen, living in Roman culture, talks to these people in Roman society about what the law was designed to do. And he says the law of Moses is like a tutor. It was designed to protect Israel. It's kind of like a fence that God built around the nation of Israel to protect them from the raw evil of the Gentile nations. Now, this fence was always, the Israelites were always climbing the fence, but the fence was up to protect Israel from that. And of course, the other part of it was to educate them about who the Lord God was. So the law was never designed to redeem people. It doesn't have that power. It doesn't have that ability. The only way, theoretically, that the law could possibly make a person right with God is if they never broke any one of the laws. Paul, in that same passage, makes the point, you break one law one time, that's it. Well, how many of us would ever come close to that? The answer, of course, is obvious. We wouldn't come close to that. So the law's purpose was very different than oftentimes people think today. One of the things that I found that when people think about the law of Moses, they think about the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments are certainly the heart and the core of it. But there are over 600 other laws that deal with every area of life, from their diet to their finances to their holy days. And I mean, it's just across the boards from A to Z. God covered really all the bases. The other thing is that the law was designed to reveal to them who God was, that God is holy and they and we are not. And so there's a great emphasis in the law on what is clean and what is unclean. And finally, the interesting situation was that the law was going to be taught by the priests, and they were also functioning as those who would arbitrate cases. One of the things we're going to see in just a moment is that when the nation of Israel was divided up and got their land area, the priestly tribe of Levi, they did not get any land, but God scattered them throughout the nation in 48 cities. Why would God do that? Well, the answer is simple. If you needed to have some interpretation of the law, or if you have an argument with your neighbor about something that you can't be resolved, you need somebody who knows the law nearby. And so God set it up so there was always somebody within probably a few miles away in one of these 48 cities that could adjudicate the law. And so that was the purpose of the law. It was to guide Israel in every area of life. So that's what Israel got down at Mount Sinai. They got the law code. Second thing is that they set up a portable worship center known as a tabernacle, and this is sort of obviously an artist's conception of it. There were a number of things that would eventually point to the great sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ. Interestingly, there was only one gate, and the whole emphasis to Israel was there's only one way that you approach God. You can't do things your own way. You're going to do it my way. You go through, they would sacrifice the animals here, and if it was a burnt offering, the animal would be sacrificed there, and then the priests could go into the tabernacle proper, which had two rooms, the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And the Ark of the Covenant, which Indiana Jones never did find, was located in here. And that was the place that nobody went except the high priest one day out of the year on the great day of atonement. He went in twice, once for his own sin and then once for the sins of the people. And this was made out of skins and fabric, and it was with posts, and they would take this thing down and set it back up. They got pretty good at this after about 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. But the point was, it was a way that God would be with His people. So that became the portable worship center, which would not be replaced for almost 500 years when the temple would be built. You can just imagine what probably some of this looked like after that period of time. If you have gone camping with your Coleman tent, after 10 years, that tent doesn't look real good. You can imagine what 450 years or so would do to it. So they built this portable worship center and was set up. And this is the place, when the book of Leviticus comes around, Moses goes into the tabernacle, tent of meeting, to receive the book of Leviticus, all the sacrificial laws and so on. So this is made down at Mount Sinai and will be transported throughout their journeys. Now, the third thing, we have the first is the giving of the law, secondly, the construction of the tabernacle, and third, God begins to organize the nation. And one of the things that he did was to set aside the tribe of Levi. Levi was the third-born son of Leah. Of the 12 sons, he was number 3. And God at this point sets Levi aside. Now, Levi had 3 sons. The sons were Gershon, Merari, and Kohath. And the reason why this would be at all important for us to know is that you're reading through the Old Testament, and you read about the Merarites or the Kohathites, and you wonder, is this some foreign nation? And the answer is no. They are a subdivision of the tribe of Levi. And each one of these subdivisions had their own assigned tasks. Now, of these 3 sons, the most important one was the middle one on the chart, Kohath, because the Kohathites, Kohath, one of his descendants was Aaron and Moses. And Aaron is now set aside as Israel's high priest. And so from this point on, the priests come from the family of Aaron only. So we say this, that all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. So you had the priests, and the Levites were kind of like the helpers. They assisted them with all of the sacrificial system and all of that kind of thing. Now, another thing that took place down there would be the assignment of the army, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. But when we look at our chart of the Old Testament, we find ourselves right here in Exodus, and we'll move through these other books a lot quicker now that we're getting established. But these 2 books, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, are in the category that I call supplemental books. We said that there were 6 of those. And these books are as important as these others, but they don't advance the storyline. So just a word about Leviticus, a word about Deuteronomy, and then we're going to move on to the book of Numbers. So the book of Leviticus was given in the newly constructed tabernacle where God met with him. And what Leviticus does is to give us more information about what took place down at Mount Sinai. Now, for most of us, frankly, if we get through start reading the book of Leviticus, we think, oh my, all of the details of these sacrifices and what you're supposed to do with this kind of sacrifice, and we get sort of overwhelmed. No wonder they needed a playbook here to tell them how to do it. But Leviticus basically had a twofold purpose. One, to teach the people of Israel how you approach God. You see, the Israelites had the same fundamental problem that I have and that you have. We are not holy people. Sin is our very nature. We do it in different ways. Some of us are more creative in our sinning than others, but we all do it. And so the problem Israel had was, okay, if we're not holy, how do we approach a holy God? And so that is laid out in intricate detail. The way to God is through these sacrifices and so on. And the bulk of the book, though, teaches them how they are to walk with God, that is, in their daily living. What does daily living look like? I'll be honest with you. I am so glad that I don't have to go by Leviticus in the way I live life. I mean, it is amazing, the details. I don't know if you want to take a look, or you can't see the back of your collar on your blouse or shirt. You realize that if it is mixed cloth, that's illegal. You can't do that. Those of you who love to go to Red Lobster, I got bad news for you. You can't eat shrimp and you can't eat lobster. It's against the dietary law. Now, it's beyond what we can do here to begin to discuss and explain why these laws are in place and their purposes. We understand today, with all of our emphasis upon gluten-free and all of this, that diet is important. Well, God was well ahead of the curve on that one in giving the people what they ought not to eat, because it would be harmful to them. So it's not that we can't learn from the law code, but it is very intricate. So there are a lot of things that Israel was told that they were to do. Now, the first part of the book deals with the offerings, and the second part has to do with all of the details of how they are to live their lives. And obviously, you can spend a lot of time in this. One of the universities that I taught at, they had a course in the book of Leviticus alone, a 2 or 3 hour course. So you can imagine the intricacy of that course. We don't have that liberty here. The key, though, to this book is that God wanted His people to be holy. That is, and holiness is a sort of a religious word, but basically it means to be clean. When God is said to be holy, it means He's clean, morally clean, spiritually clean. And so sometimes we lose the whole idea of holy. That's kind of not sure what that means. But the idea is that there's a moral cleanliness, a spiritual cleanliness about us, and that's what God was seeking for His people. Now, the other book is that of Deuteronomy. Now, Israel has been down at Mount Sinai, and of course, if the alternate view is correct, Sinai is over here. But at this point in time, it's not important. They will leave Mount Sinai, and they will go up to this wide spot in the road called Kadesh Barnea. Now, obviously, if Mount Sinai is over there, it's about the same distance up to this place called Kadesh Barnea. And when they get to Kadesh Barnea, they are at the southern boundary of the Promised Land. Right here is the Wadi El Arish, which is the dividing line between Canaan and Egypt. And so that's where it goes, to the southern part of the Dead Sea and then on up into some other places. So what God is doing now is bringing them right up to the doorway of the Promised Land. Now, this brings us partly to the book of Numbers, but in the book of Numbers, they're still down here at Mount Sinai. And one of the things that happens, among a number of things, but they need a military and they need an organization. And each one of the 12 tribes is given a 5-star general, so to speak, to be in charge of the army of Ephraim, the army of Judah, and so on. And so what they did was they discovered here are the qualifications. You have to be a male. No ladies served in the military. You had to be over 20 years old. You could not be a Levite. The Levites were separated to the service of God. And if you were over 20 and a male, you had to be physically able to fight. I would not have qualified at this point. I mean, I'm over 20, but you don't want me on the battlefield with you, But anyway, what they discovered was that in the totality of Israel, there were 603,550 who fit that category. Now, as far as the demographics are concerned, it is fundamentally established that given those parameters, that this normally, in a normal situation, you will have either 1/4 to 1/5 of your total population who will fit those parameters. And this is where we arrive at the idea that Israel was 2.5 to 3 million people. It's because of this particular census. So they're going to take a journey from Mount Sinai up to Kadesh Barnea, and an interesting thing happens. They complain a couple of times, and God immediately disciplines his people in a variety of ways. And we kind of wonder, well, hey, going down from Egypt down to Sinai, wherever it is, they complained and fussed all the time, and God didn't do anything. What's the difference? Well, they have made an agreement now with God at Sinai. We will obey you. And now they're not doing that, and God says, oh, remember, time out. We have a covenant. And so he now begins to discipline these people. So when we come to the book of Numbers, they go up, they end up at Kadesh Barnea. So they're launched, they're ready to go. And so they now are going to send spies into the land. One of the top guys from each one of the 12 tribes. Now what's interesting is that when Moses, 40 years later, reflects back on the incident, it wasn't the people who originated the idea. It was, it wasn't God who originated the idea, it was the people. And basically they're saying, hey, we're going to go into a land we've never been in, need to do a little reconnaissance. But underneath it all was the fact that they really weren't quite sure that God knew what he was doing in all of this. God says, okay, let them go in because they're going to see that the land that I have, I'm giving you is absolutely beautiful. It's an excellent land. So the 12 spies go in and they come back. And their report is, by a vote of 12 to nothing, this is a fantastic land. Now remember, these people have been wandering in the wilderness all this time, and they look at this land and they see a productive land, a beautiful land. Now, if you've seen pictures of Israel from the past, it kind of looks barren, but you got to remember that in the days of Joshua, this was a heavily forested area, and Israel today has planted almost 300 million trees. They're returning back to what it once was. So they come back and they say, oh my goodness, what an amazing land. But then a second issue came up, can we take it? And by a vote of 10 to 2, they said, no, we can't. Two spies by the name of Joshua and Caleb, who will be part of the story, they said, we can take it. God's with us. They came back, these other spies said, you know, the nations in this land are mightier than we are militarily. And by the way, God would say, you're right. In fact, there are actually, if you want to know, there are 7 nations stronger than you militarily. And they said, on top of that, there are fortified cities. I mean, these things are impregnable fortresses. Right, there are actually 31 of them, if you want to know. And furthermore, they got really big people there. Monstrosities of men, Goliath type, if you wish. We're like little grasshoppers there. We can't do it. And Joshua and Caleb said, yes, we can. But the result of all of this is that the people said, we're out of here. Moses, when it comes to being a leader, you are a failure. You know what we're going to do? We're going to get a new leader and we're going back to Egypt. Oh, those were the days, my friend. We thought they'd never end. Down there in Egypt. Do you not remember you were slaves down there? Do you not remember all the groaning down there in Egypt? So God says, Moses, step aside. I'm going to destroy these people. You know, enough. We're all tired of this complaining. And Moses, being a man who had a heart for God, he said, Lord, you don't want to do that. You know, the Egyptians and everyone else are going to hear that you brought them out with a mighty hand out of Egypt, but you weren't strong enough to bring them into the land. That's why you destroyed them. Lord, your reputation's at stake here. You don't want to do that. And I think God was smiling. He said, that's my man, Moses. And he said, okay, I'll tell you what. I will pardon them because you've asked me to. But there is a consequences to them disobeying me. And the consequences is they're going to wander in this wilderness for 40 years. You talk about a wasted life, wandering in the wilderness. But that's in fact what would take place. So we come now, fast forward if you wish, 40 years later, and where are they? Well, would you believe it? We're back at Kadesh Barnea again, because God said, okay, let's go back and start over again on this. And in the story of Numbers, what happens next is that they now journey southward to a place called Mount Hor, and a couple of things happen there. One of them is that Aaron, the high priest, dies. This is kind of an interesting thing. He walks up to the mountain. God says, oh, by the way, Moses, take your brother Aaron and his boy Eleazar and go up to the top of the mountain because Aaron's going to die up there. Have you ever thought of walking to your own funeral? That would be kind of a spooky thing, wouldn't it? But that's what happened. So up to the top of Mount Hor they go. Aaron dies, and now we have a transference of authority to his son Eleazar. Well, then they continue on, and down in this area, Moses, the people are complaining, as they always did. We're thirsty. We want water. And God says, okay, we'll give them water out of the rock. Moses, speak to the rock, and the water will gush forth for them. That's a lot of water, by the way, for 3 million people and all their cattle. But God says, we can do this. Moses is ticked off. He is so sick and tired of these people. You know, as a leader, he's got nothing but grief from them. For 40 years, grief. And so he is so ticked off, he picks up his stick and he bam, bam, the rock. Now, there were a group of people who knew that God said, speak to the rock. See, that's a small issue. But what we don't recognize is Moses was a man of great privilege. And with great privilege goes great responsibility. And if God allowed Moses to get away with what is clearly in the mind of many an act of disobedience, I mean, these people are already geared towards that. It's just going to speed up the disobedience. So God says to Moses, Moses, you didn't treat me, you didn't respect me in front of the people. I got bad news for you, and that is you're not going into the land. I'll let you look at it, but you can't go into it. Oh, Lord, please. Moses does this 3 times. God finally says, will you stop it? You're not going into the land. So, poor Moses, but at this point as well, Israel has been complaining, and they complain one more time, and this is a story of God bringing an immediate judgment. I think it's worth telling because Jesus makes reference to this event. When they began to complain, God said, you know what? I'm going to teach them a lesson. I'm going to send poisonous snakes amongst them, and they get bit. And if they get bit, they've got to do something. And what they have to do is, Moses, by the way, would you make a snake out of bronze? Put it up on a pole and put it down in the middle of the camp where people are gathered around. So if let's say Scott and I are walking through the camp of Israel, and we both get bitten by a poisonous snake, ow, and Scott says to me, oh, what are we going to do? I said, well, I'm going to get my Boy Scout snake bite kit, and I'm going to put the tourniquet on, and I'm going to suck the poison out. And Scott says, you know, God says if we get bit, if we just go down and look up at that bronze snake, we'll be fine. And I said to him, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I mean, if you get bit by a snake, you don't go looking at a bronze snake on a pole. And so, what happens? I'm going to go back to my tent and do the suction business and tourniquet. He goes down and looks at the snake on the bronze pole. Guess who lives and guess who dies? You say, well, why? Jesus makes it clear. What God was trying to get them to do, he is so tired of them not believing what he has to say. He says, I don't care whether you think it is rational or not, you will look at that snake if you would like to live. You don't want to live, that's cool with me, you'll die. But if you want to live, look at that bronze snake. Jesus made this statement in the famous John chapter 3, the God so loved the world chapter. Right after this, he says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man, referring to himself, is going to be lifted up, referring to being lifted up on the cross. And everyone who looks to him in faith is the idea, will be delivered, will be saved. And as Paul reflects upon this in the book of 1 Corinthians, the world at large thinks that is stupid. In fact, he uses a Greek word moros, from which we get our word moron from. That is moronic. To think that somehow a crucified Jew back in around 33 AD, somehow me living, I'm a 21st century guy, that somehow that's going to deliver me, that makes no sense at all. God says, yes, it does, because I said so. And it is my Son who died, and if you believe and look to him, you will have eternal life. You don't? Well, that's your choice. And so Jesus uses this event to illustrate things. Now, they then go this rather interesting route because the Edomites, relatives of theirs, won't let them pass through the land. And again, people complain, thinking that Moses' GPS is fouled up, don't know what he's doing. He ends up here on the east side of the Jordan River. And so they come up here, and this is what the book of Numbers is about. It's talking about the cleaning out of the east side of the Jordan. They come up to Heshbon, which is the capital city of the Amorites, and they say to the Amorites, look, folks, we won't drink your water, we're not going to eat your food, we just want passage to their land. And the Amorites say, over our dead bodies, you're going to go through our land. Moses says, well, have it your way. And they wipe out the Amorites, and then they head up north to the Bashanites, and whose king is Og. Can you imagine any mother naming their child Og? I think the reason is he's ugly. He's got to be an ugly baby. But anyway, Og is this huge monstrosity of a man. According to the text of Scripture, he slept in a bed that was 13 feet long. I don't think he was 5'8" and just liked a big bed. This guy's a huge guy. The spies were right. There are a lot of big people in this land. So they go up and they clean out that territory, and a lot of the detail is given by Moses in Deuteronomy. Then they come back down here, and they have to deal with Moabites and Midianites and so on. And when the dust settles, they basically have depopulated the east side of the Jordan, which is not part of the land given to Abraham. However, this side now, there are 3 of the 12 tribes who ask for the privilege of staying on this side because it was an excellent land for herds. So the Reubenites, the people of the tribe of Gad, and then half of the tribe of Manasseh are going to end up on the east side. And the point that is made to them is, okay, you can, but you can leave your families on the east side, but you got to send your troops on the west side as we clean out the folks there. So this brings us now to the book of Deuteronomy, where they have now come up on the east side of the Jordan. And Deuteronomy is basically the sermons of Moses that are given on the east side of the Jordan. I think you perhaps remember in a previous study we said that these are 2 Greek words. Deuteros means second, nomos means law. This, in essence, is the second giving of the Mosaic law code. It's not identical, it's not a Xeroxed copy of it, but it is basically the same thing. And it's given because you have a whole generation who have were not down at Mount Sinai. And so they need to learn from the lawgiver Moses about this law. And just we don't have a lot of time on this, but what Moses is basically doing is reviewing their journey. He tells us things that we wouldn't know otherwise. But particularly the second part, where he reviews the law and applies it, that particularly is the heart and core of what Moses is doing. And then you have the sermons end with Moses appealing to the people to follow the Lord and to honor Him and to live for Him. And then the final chapters recount the ministry of Moses' his last days. Now, one of the things that Deuteronomy does is to tell us about the size of the land of promise. We now begin to understand a little bit more detail. The land of promise, we know for sure the Wadi El Arish, we know the southern boundary, we know this part up the Jordan River Valley. We have places like Lebo Hamath, which are identifiable as the northern boundary. But it is to the river Euphrates, which is this river. What we don't know is whether this line actually extends this way or not. So the land that was given to Abraham in today's terms includes Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, a little bit of Jordan, and a little bit of Egypt as well. And of course, we know the contention that's going on related to the land of promise. But that will be eventually what Israel will get as part of God's commitment to them. Now, we have moved rather quickly, to be sure. We have people, we have law. We are now positioned just outside the land of Canaan. And now something happens. Moses dies. But before he dies, there is the transference of ruling authority from Moses to Joshua in a very public way. In fact, a couple of times before the nation. Hey, everybody, Moses is going to die. Here's your next leader. This is Joshua, a good man. He's been leading the armies, and he is now going to be your leader. Listen to him. Obey him. It's interesting, by the way, that once Joshua took control, Israel never grumbled and complained again. So I don't know what to make of that, but he had it a little bit better than Moses did. So Joshua had a job description that had two parts to it. Number one, Joshua was to break the back of Canaanite power by destroying the fortified cities. And we learn from the book of Joshua that there were 31 of those. Now remember, this is you couldn't launch mortars over the walls. You had to basically besiege them, starve them out, or something. You're not going to batter down the walls. So taking a fortified city was not an easy task. But when Joshua is done, it will be 31 cities total will be the amount. Secondly, Joshua was committed to dividing up the land. Once they got the land, who gets what territory? And Joshua will make that decision based upon the casting of lots. So Joshua, when his life is over, it's said that he was faithful. He did everything God told him to do. But it was just those two things that God told him to do. Now, one of the things that when we look at the taking of the land, and God told Israel to annihilate the Canaanites. Now, before you feel too sorry for the Canaanites, you have to read two passages of Scripture, Deuteronomy 7 and Leviticus 18, especially Leviticus 18, which talks of the utter depravity of these people. I mean, they have gone as far down as a civilization can possibly go in their immorality, in their child sacrifice, the whole thing. And God said, you got to get rid of these people. They are spiritually contaminated. You got to stay away from them. They just have to be eliminated. By the way, though, the Canaanites could have been out of the land in 2 days if they decided to get up and move, but they chose not to. Again, and it's beyond the point of this study, but archaeology has discovered what the Bible has said all along, and that is that the religion of the Canaanites was a fertility religion. Now, one other thing that we want to talk about is the length of the conquest of the land of Canaan. Initially, we said that the book of Joshua, the book of victory, covers about 30 years. But in actuality, the focus is on about a 6-year period of time. And the conquest of the land is based upon the testimony of one of those spies by the name of Caleb. And if I could read this to you out of Joshua chapter 14. And Caleb says this as they're getting ready to divide the land up. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. I brought back word to him as was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the people fear and all of that. So he says in verse 10 of Joshua 14, and now behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke these 45 years, from the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, when Israel walked in the wilderness, and now, behold, I am 85 years old today. So, Caleb says, when I was a spy, went into the land, I was 40 years old at the time. Now, today, I'm 85. And so, again, you don't need to be a whiz in math to figure this out, but that means that between the time he went into spy and the time when they're getting ready to divide the land up, now that it's been conquered, is a period of 45 years. Now, we know that Israel spent about 39 years in the wilderness. We usually say 40. Technically, it's probably a little bit less than that, but 39. So what that means is that the conquest of the land of Canaan took about 5 to 7 years. And that comes from the testimony of Caleb. So what we will do in our next study as we get started there is to finish off the book of Joshua by just looking at an overview of the conquest of the land, which would be in 3 primary stages. But Caleb's testimony is important because when you read about the conquest in Joshua 6 through 12, those 6, 7 chapters, you can read it in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and you don't sense the time frame involved. It's between 5 and 7 years. So in our next study, we're going to actually see the nation formed, and we will move on into the theocracy period, and beyond that into the monarchy period. It takes a while to get the nation formed, but we've done pretty well, actually. We've covered 715 years of time and in just a couple of sessions. So hopefully we will get started again and take a look at the continued progress here in the Old Testament.